The Legend of Cecil, the lion that changed the world. Today you will discover the true story behind the death of Cecil the Lion, the shooter, and the strategies he used to commit such cruelty to one of our planet's lions. If you're interested in learning about the lives of lions, be sure to subscribe to the channel and let's get to the video. In the vast and imposing savannas of Wang National Park in Zimbabwe, a lion cub was born in 2002 under the watchful eye of a dominant coalition. This young lion, who would later be called Cecil, seemed at first glance just another among the many cubs running free through the African wildlands. However, from an early age, his distinctive appearance began to emerge. While his siblings had golden manes, his, over time, became a deep black, marking him uniquely and powerfully. This soon set him apart from any other lion in the region. Cecil grew up in an environment where the struggle for survival was constant. He was a member of a coalition that had to face not only the harsh conditions of nature, but also other rival lions hungry for territories and females. As he aged, he became increasingly strong and cunning. His first real battle occurred when he was just over 3 years old, facing Cecil, a veteran lion who had led a rival pack for years. The fight between them was fierce and brutal. The roars echoed for miles around the park, and the blood of both stained the tall grass. In the end, Cecil emerged victorious, though not without injuries. With this victory, he secured his place as the leader of his own coalition, taking over a vast and fertile territory within the park. His fame began to grow among both lions and human visitors. Researchers from the University of Oxford soon identified him as a special specimen and began to monitor him with a GPS collar, fascinated by his strength and his black mane that dramatically contrasted with the arid landscape. Despite the glory of his victories, Cecil faced constant challenges. Each year brought new rivals, young males willing to challenge his supremacy. During a particularly harsh winter, a coalition of 3 brother lions arrived in Cecil's territory. They were young, full of vigor, and believed they could defeat the king of the park. The battles dragged on for days, with casualties on both sides. Cecil's fate seemed uncertain, and for a moment, his human allies, the researchers, feared he would not survive the confrontation. However, once again, his cunning and experience prevailed, forcing the young lions to retreat and securing a few more years of reign. During this time, Cecil also proved to be a charismatic leader, forming deep bonds with other females and keeping his coalition strong and united. He was often seen protecting his cubs, teaching them to hunt, and guiding them through the savannas. He was not only a relentless hunter, but also a careful guardian, a true patriarch. For many who visited Wang, spotting Cecil was a privilege. His majestic stature and calm demeanor, even amid human presence, made him the center of attention. However, in the underworld of sport hunting, stories about Cecil were beginning to circulate. Trophy hunters, drawn by the fame of his black mane and dominant presence, saw him as a coveted trophy. Among these hunters was Walter Palmer, an American dentist with an obsession for hunting the world's largest predators. Palmer heard about Cecil through local contacts and soon began planning a hunt that, in his mind, would be the pinnacle of his collection. As Cecil continued his life, unaware of the imminent danger, Palmer drew ever closer to his coalition. The danger was getting closer, but for now, Cecil remained safe within the bounds of the park, where hunting was strictly forbidden. The researchers, who had been monitoring his movements for years, began to notice strange patterns. Cecil was approaching areas dangerously close to the edge of the park, something he normally did not do. There was a growing sense of concern among them, but before they could act, something happened. One night, during a typical hunt for Cecil and his coalition, he was lured to an unfamiliar area beyond the safety of his territory. A strong, irresistible scent led him to the edge of the park. It was bait left by Palmer's hunters. Cecil, unaware he was being manipulated, crossed the invisible boundary. The moment he stepped out of the protection of the park, his fate was sealed. The sky over Wang was dark that night. The stars shone brightly as Cecil ventured beyond the park's limits. Guided by the scent of fresh meat, he did not realize he was being led directly into a trap. The local hunters, working with Walter Palmer, were alert, their eyes fixed on the imposing black-maned lion advancing silently through the savannah. Cecil, oblivious to the danger, continued to follow the trail, his coalition remaining at a safe distance. He did not know that, at that moment, he was being watched, not just by the natural predators of the savannah, but by men who were prepared to bring him down. Suddenly, an arrow cut through the air, slicing the quiet night. The impact was not fatal, but it hit Cecil in his flank, causing him to roar in pain. Wounded, he staggered, the instinct to survive taking over his body. He tried to return to the safety of his territory, but his body was already succumbing to the injury. The pain was intense, and blood began to stain his black mane. The hunters, however, were not willing to let him escape. Walter Palmer, excited at the prospect of his trophy, watched from afar. For him, the suffering of the lion was just part of the game. But for Cecil, each step became more difficult, his immense strength beginning to fail. For hours, the lion wandered the savannah, each movement marked by the internal struggle between his desire to live and the growing exhaustion that overtook him. The camera now focuses on his eyes. They still carry the same determination that made him a leader of his coalition, but there is something more, a foreboding that he might not survive the night. Time seemed to drag on for Cecil, and the park, which had once been his kingdom, was now too far for him to reach. Growing weaker, he tried to hide among the bushes, but the hunters knew exactly where he was. Walter Palmer, with his bow in hand, prepared to deliver the final blow. He approached cautiously, the excitement of the moment growing as if he were on the verge of a great achievement. The roars of pain from Cecil echoed through the night, reaching the ears of the coalition he had led so well. The females and the young, hidden somewhere in the park, felt the absence of their protector. They knew something was wrong but were powerless to save him. The camera cuts to images of the cubs, lying quietly, perhaps waiting for the return of their father. A return that would never happen. At that moment, Walter Palmer approached. The hunter could feel his heart racing in his chest. For him, this was a moment of glory. He raised his bow, preparing the last arrow. As the camera slowly zooms in on Cecil, we can see that his eyes, once bright and full of life, were now clouded with pain and fatigue. However, even in his last moments, the lion maintained his majestic posture. Even wounded, even on the brink of death, he remained the king of the savannah. Palmer released the arrow, and it found its mark. With a roar that echoed for miles, Cecil finally fell. The sound of his fall seemed to shake the very earth. Palmer and the local hunters approached, victorious. But what seemed like a triumph to them would become an irreparable tragedy to the rest of the world. They took Cecil's mane, turning the symbol of his majesty into a trophy. Cecil's body was left behind, his spirit, which for years had dominated those lands, now silenced forever. The coalition of lions, leaderless, began to disintegrate. The females were vulnerable, and the cubs, without their father's protection, were now at the mercy of rival predators. However, the impact of Cecil's death was not limited to the savannas of Zimbabwe. Almost immediately, the news of his death began to circulate among the researchers at the University of Oxford, who had been monitoring him for years. When they realized that Cecil's GPS was no longer moving, they knew something terrible had happened. The scientific team, devastated, soon discovered what had occurred. The news traveled quickly out of Africa, reaching the United Kingdom and then the United States. Social media exploded with outrage. Cecil was not just any lion. He was a celebrity, a symbol of wildlife in its purest form. The public was shocked to learn that he had been hunted for sport, especially in such a cruel manner. Photos of Palmer, proud beside Cecil's body, soon flooded headlines around the world, generating a wave of outrage. In cities across the globe, demonstrations against sport hunting began to emerge. People in the streets held up signs with images of Cecil and phrases calling for an end to trophy hunting. Animal protection organizations and environmentalists quickly united to demand a review of sport hunting laws, both in Zimbabwe and internationally. Cecil's case now symbolized something much larger: the urgent need to protect wildlife from human predators. Walter Palmer found himself at the center of a storm of criticism. His dental clinic was temporarily closed as protesters gathered outside his home and office, demanding justice for Cecil. However, The laws at the time were still flawed, and technically, Palmer had not broken any of Zimbabwe's hunting laws since the lion was taken outside the park's boundaries. Meanwhile, in Zimbabwe, authorities began investigating the local hunting guides, trying to understand how such an important creature had been lured out of the park and killed. Cecil's death pressed the government to reconsider its wildlife protection policies, but changes would not happen overnight. The news of Cecil's death rapidly spread across social media and international media, sparking a whirlwind of protests. In Zimbabwe, the local population was in shock, and safari guides who knew Cecil were outraged by the way he had been lured and killed. In the United States, Walter Palmer's name became synonymous with cruelty and greed. Protesters gathered in front of his home and dental clinic, forcing him to hide. In London, New York, and other major cities, thousands of people came together to demand an end to sport hunting and the protection of endangered animals. Public outrage reached its peak when protesters, enraged by Palmer's apparent impunity, stormed his dental clinic in Minnesota. Although he was absent, the building was vandalized, with graffiti reading "Cecil's Killer" and "Justice for Lions." This moment marked a turning point. Sport hunting, a practice once confined to specific groups, became a public international debate. Public opinion demanded change. As pressure on Palmer increased, voices for justice began to resonate within global conservation organizations. Cecil's death, initially just another case of sport hunting, transformed into a global symbol of the struggle for wildlife preservation. Petitions for stricter legislation began to circulate and reach record numbers, forcing lawmakers to publicly debate the impact of trophy hunting. In Zimbabwe, the government, which initially hesitated to intervene, was forced to act. Wildlife officials began a thorough investigation into the involvement of local hunting guides and the legality of Cecil's killing. The Ministry of Environment announced it would review all hunting permits in the area, with a promise to restrict hunts around Wang National Park. However, the challenges remained. Many in Zimbabwe, including government members, relied on revenues from hunting tourism. There was a conflict between protecting wildlife and the economic pressures that favored trophy sport hunting. Even so, global outrage pressured the government to take action, and for the first time, the possibility of a total ban on the hunting of large predators began to be debated. In an unprecedented event, Cecil's death was mentioned during a United Nations session on wildlife conservation. Representatives from various African nations, pressured by public opinion, began to openly discuss the need for stricter international policies to protect lions, elephants, and other endangered animals. Environmentalists demanded that sport hunting of large predators be banned in protected areas, and that tougher measures be implemented against hunters who, like Palmer, exploited legal loopholes. From this debate, a broader global conservation movement began to form, uniting governments, NGOs, and citizens in a common cause, to ensure that tragedies like Cecil's would not be repeated. The future of Cecil's coalition as the world mobilized for conservation, Cecil's Lion Coalition faced its own internal crisis. Without their leader, the power balance within the group began to crumble. Rivals from nearby coalitions sensed the weakness and started to invade Cecil's territory. The echo of his absence was felt not just among the lions, but throughout the entire food chain of the park. In a desperate attempt to keep the coalition together, researchers from the University of Oxford tried to observe the behaviors of the remaining lions more closely, but without Cecil, the group began to fragment. New males tried to take control, often resulting in violent confrontations. The females tried to protect the cubs, but the instability made the future uncertain. Months after Cecil's death, the impact of his story continued to reverberate. In Zimbabwe, the government announced new measures to restrict trophy hunting near protected areas like Wang National Park. Although a complete ban on sport hunting had not yet been implemented, international pressure forced significant changes in conservation policies. The University of Oxford, along with other conservation organizations, created the Cecil Fund, dedicated to protecting Africa's big cats. This fund was established to raise awareness of the challenges faced by lions, ensure ongoing monitoring of large predators, and promote the creation of safe reserves where hunting was not allowed. Cecil's name became a global icon in the fight for wildlife preservation. Public outrage led countries like the United States and the United Kingdom to review their laws on the importation of hunting trophies. In a severe blow to trophy hunters, new regulations made it harder to transport parts of killed animals back to their home countries. The trade in lion trophies was drastically restricted, marking a significant victory for environmentalists and animal rights advocates. Cecil's story, which began in tragedy, now lived on as an inspiring force for millions of people around the world. His images, once a symbol of His Majesty, were now used to represent the fight against illegal hunting and sport hunting. Documentaries were produced, books were written, and entire conservation movements arose in his name. In Wang National Park, Cecil's coalition never fully recovered, but his memory continued to live in every lion that roamed the plains. Tourists, who once came in search of the king with the black mane, now came to see Cecil's legacy and how his story had changed the course of conservation worldwide. Attention now focuses on a young lion, the cub of one of the females from Cecil's coalition. He runs across the plains, practicing his hunting skills, revealing a small mane beginning to grow, with shades of black reminiscent of his father. He carries the spirit of Cecil and, hopefully, will grow up in a world where he and other lions can live without the fear of death at human hands. Cecil's legacy was not just that of a great lion, but of a fundamental change in how the world viewed conservation. In his death, he gave birth to a movement that will continue to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And if you enjoyed this story of Cecil the Lion, I will leave at the end of the video the story of the son of Sekakama, one of the world's largest and most famous lions. Watch now.